The air in Clay County, Mississippi in the autumn of 1915 was thick with the scent of decay. It was a familiar smell: damp earth, rotting timber, the slow, sweet decomposition of the bayou. But on the night of October 28th, Deputy Miller caught a different scent on the wind as he approached the old Barlow homestead. It was metallic and cloying, a butcher shop odor that had no place miles from any town. The house stood silhouetted against a bruised twilight sky, a skeletal shape against the cypress trees. No lamps burned in the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. The place was as silent as a tomb, a silence that felt heavier and more profound than mere emptiness. Sheriff Brody had sent him out to check on the Barlow sisters after weeks of unsettling rumors, and more concretely, the disappearance of a traveling salesman last seen heading down this very road. The sisters, Althea and Clementine, had become local legends in the span of a few short months, transforming from destitute orphans into women of inexplicable means. Their sudden fortune was a thing of whispers, a topic spoken of in hushed, fearful tones at the general store. As Miller pushed open the front gate, its hinges screaming in protest, the feeling of trespass was immediate and overwhelming. He wasn't just entering a property. He was crossing a threshold into a place that felt fundamentally wrong, a place where the natural laws of the world had been bent and broken. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer echoing unnaturally in the heavy stillness. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the faint breeze, a dark, gaping mouth inviting him into the heart of the macabre mystery that had festered within these walls. He stepped inside, and the smell grew stronger, a horrifying confirmation that the whispers about the Barlow sisters hadn't even scratched the surface of the truth. Inside, the house was a paradox. The front parlor, once bare and dilapidated, was now furnished with opulent, albeit mismatched pieces: a velvet settee, a polished mahogany table, a gramophone of gleaming brass. It was the material evidence of their newfound wealth, jarringly out of place against the backdrop of water-stained walls and floorboards that groaned under Miller's weight. But a thick layer of dust covered everything, as if the house had been abandoned in a great hurry. The air was cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. As he moved deeper into the home, his boots crunching on something scattered across the floor, he looked down. It was dried leaves and twigs, arranged in strange, spiral patterns that led from the doorway toward a room at the back of the house. It was a deliberate trail, a path laid for some unknown purpose. The silence was the most unnerving part. It wasn't just quiet. It was a void of sound, as if the very air was too dense to carry a vibration. He called out their names: Althea, Clementine. His voice was swallowed by the oppressive quiet, receiving no echo, no reply. He moved past the parlor, through a small dining area where a single plate sat on the table, a fork resting beside it, coated in a dark, dried substance. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. This was the source of the smell. It was a deep, guttural stench of rot and iron, a forbidden aroma that spoke of unholy things. The door was locked, but a dark, viscous liquid had seeped from beneath it, staining the wooden floorboards a deep, ugly brown. Whatever secrets the Barlow sisters held, whatever horrifying truth lay behind their fortune, Miller knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was waiting for him on the other side of that door. To understand the horrifying events of 1915, we must first rewind, back to a time before the whispers and the fortune, before the darkness took root in the Barlow home. Althea and Clementine Barlow were the daughters of a failed cotton farmer who had lost his spirit long before his body finally gave out. Their mother, a frail woman worn down by poverty and sorrow, followed him to the grave a year later, leaving the two sisters utterly alone in a world that had little sympathy for orphans. Their inheritance was a decaying farmhouse, several acres of sour, unworkable land, and a legacy of destitution. Althea, the elder by 5 years, was pragmatic and hard, her spirit calloused by a lifetime of want. Clementine was the dreamer, fragile and quiet, with eyes that seemed to see things others did not: ghosts in the Spanish moss, futures in the patterns of stirred tea leaves. For years, they survived on the very edge of existence. They patched the leaking roof with tar and old tin, mended their threadbare dresses until they were more stitched than fabric, and ate whatever they could forage or trap in the surrounding swamp. The townsfolk of Clay's Landing regarded them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They were outsiders, isolated by their poverty and the remote location of their home. They represented a grim reminder of how quickly fortunes could turn in the harsh realities of the Mississippi Delta. In the spring of 1915, however, their desperation reached a breaking point. A blight took what little they had in their vegetable garden, and the creek they fished from ran low and stagnant. Starvation was no longer a distant threat. It was a guest at their table. It was during these bleak, hopeless days that Althea, driven by a will to survive that bordered on ferocious, began exploring the last remnants of their family's history, locked away in a heavy sea chest in the attic. She was looking for anything of value to sell. What she found, however, was not something that could be traded for coin. It was something that promised coin and much more, in exchange for a price that no sane person would ever consider paying. The chest was filled with the mundane relics of a forgotten lineage, faded photographs, brittle letters, a christening gown yellowed with age. But at the very bottom, beneath a false floor, lay a single object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a book, not a Bible or a family ledger, but something far older, its leather cover worn smooth and featureless by the touch of countless hands. There was no title on its spine, no author's name on the flyleaf. The pages were vellum, not paper, and they were filled with a spidery, archaic script, interspersed with disturbing diagrams and woodcut illustrations of a deeply unsettling nature. It was a grimoire, a book of forbidden knowledge passed down from a distant, disgraced ancestor, a woman whispered to have been exiled from Europe for practicing the darkest of arts. The book spoke of pacts and rituals, of entities that lingered in the spaces between worlds, and of the immense power they offered to those who were willing to pay the required tribute. The language was arcane, filled with sigils and incantations that felt alien on the tongue. Clementine, with her natural inclination toward the unseen, was both terrified and fascinated. Althea, however, saw not a path to damnation, but a tool for survival. She spent her nights by candlelight, her finger tracing the strange script, her lips murmuring the ancient words. The book described a ritual of transference, a way to trade a thing of little value for a thing of great value. It was called the Pact of the Gilded Flesh, and it was a horrifyingly simple transaction. It required a sacrifice, an offering of living flesh, given freely to the hungry, unseen world. In return, the world would repay the favor, not with gold or silver, but with fortune. It would manifest luck, create opportunity, and literally draw wealth from the ether. For Althea, whose world had been defined by lack, the promise was too powerful to ignore. The only question was what or who would serve as the first offering. The first sacrifice was small, a scrawny chicken, one of the last they owned. Following the grimoire's instructions to the letter, Althea and Clementine took the bird to a clearing deep within the cypress swamp behind their home, to a spot where the ground was always damp and the air unnaturally cold. The ritual was performed at the stroke of midnight, under a sliver of a moon. Althea drew a complex symbol on the ground with a mixture of ash and river clay, a symbol she had copied directly from the book's disturbing pages. Clementine, shaking, held the chicken as Althea chanted the strange, guttural words. The incantation was a macabre litany, a promise of flesh and lifeblood in exchange for prosperity. At the ritual's climax, Althea took the bird and with a swift, brutal motion ended its life upon the sigil. They left the offering there as the book commanded and walked back to their silent, dark house without looking back. The next morning nothing had changed. The cupboards were still bare, the poverty just as crushing. Clementine wept, convinced they had damned their souls for nothing. Althea, however, remained impassive, her resolve unshaken. She insisted the book said the return might not be immediate. 3 days passed in tense, hungry silence. On the morning of the 4th day, as Clementine went to fetch water from their nearly dry well, she found it. Lying at the bottom of the bucket, gleaming amidst the murky water, was a single gold coin. It was an American eagle, dated 1899, perfectly preserved. It wasn't tarnished or dirtied as if it hadn't been dropped, but had simply materialized from nothing. There was no explanation for its presence. No one had been near their property. It was impossible. But there it was, heavy and real in Clementine's trembling hand. The fortune had begun. The pact was real. And as they stared at the impossible coin, a chilling realization dawned upon them both. If the life of one small chicken was worth a gold coin, what would the life of a human being be worth? The gold coin changed everything. It bought them flour, salt, and cured meat, enough to last them a month. It was a taste of security they had not known in years, and it was intoxicating. But it was also a curse. Once the initial relief wore off, the hunger for more returned, stronger than before. The memory of their destitution was a fresh wound, and the single coin was merely a bandage, not a cure. Althea returned to the grimoire, her obsession growing with every passing day. The book promised that the scale of the reward would always match the scale of the sacrifice. Small life yielded small returns. To truly reverse their fortunes, to build a fortress of wealth that would protect them from ever starving again, the offerings would need to become more significant. The idea was planted, a dark seed in the fertile ground of their desperation. At first, it was an unspoken horror, a thought that lingered at the edge of their minds. They began to notice the world differently. They saw the stray dogs that sometimes wandered onto their property not as animals, but as potential. They eyed their neighbors' livestock with a new, unsettling calculus. The moral boundaries that had governed their lives began to blur and erode, washed away by the promise of a life free from want. It was Althea who first gave voice to the idea. She spoke of the travelers who used the old dirt road that passed by their farm, drifters, salesmen, men with no families and no roots, whose disappearance would go unnoticed for weeks, if at all. It was a horrifying suggestion, a leap into a bottomless abyss of depravity. Clementine was aghast, her gentle nature recoiling from the monstrousness of the thought, but Althea was persuasive. She painted a picture of their future, a life of comfort and safety, and contrasted it with the slow, grinding death of starvation they had just escaped. She argued it was a matter of survival, that the world was a cruel, uncaring place, and they had been given a forbidden tool to fight back. Clementine's protests grew weaker with each passing day, her will slowly succumbing to her older sister's iron resolve and the seductive memory of that single, impossible gold coin. The transition from sacrificing animals to preying on humans did not happen overnight. It was a gradual descent, a staircase into madness built one horrifying step at a time. They began with livestock stolen from neighboring farms under the cover of darkness. A pig from the Miller farm, a goat from the Pruitts. Each macabre ritual, performed with increasing efficiency in the cold swamp clearing, yielded greater returns. Antique jewelry would appear on their dressers. Silverware, pristine and polished, would be found nestled in their kitchen drawers. The house began to fill with objects of value, each one a testament to their dark deeds, each one a link in the chain that bound them to the grimoire's pact. The townsfolk of Clay's Landing noticed the change. The Barlow sisters were no longer gaunt and hollow-eyed. They wore new dresses, simple but well-made. They bought supplies at the general store not with credit, but with old, unusual coins that the store owner, Mr. Abernathy, accepted with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The whispers started then. Some said they'd found a hidden family treasure. Others speculated that they were receiving money from a wealthy, secret relative. But a darker, more superstitious rumor began to take hold among the field hands and swamp folk, that the sisters were engaged in conjure, in hoodoo, that they had made a deal with something ancient and unholy that lived in the bayou. Their isolation, once a mark of their poverty, now became a source of fear. People began to avoid the road that led past their farm, especially after dark. The place began to feel cursed, tainted. If you want to see how this chilling story unfolds and support our exploration of history's most forbidden tales, take a moment to subscribe. The path the Barlow sisters chose leads to a place far darker than any of their neighbors could have ever imagined. Their fortune was growing, but the price of their pact was about to escalate in the most horrifying way possible. The first human victim was a drifter named Silas, a man whose past was as worn as his boots. He was heading nowhere in particular and came from nowhere anyone knew. He made the mistake of stopping at the Barlow homestead to ask for a drink of water. Althea, with a disarming smile that did not reach her cold eyes, invited him in for a meal. Clementine, pale and trembling, served him a bowl of stew, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Silas, grateful for the unexpected kindness, was oblivious to the predatory stillness in the room, to the way Althea watched his every move, her focus as sharp and deadly as a hawk's. The stew was drugged with a potent sedative Clementine had prepared from herbs described in the grimoire, herbs said to calm the spirit for its journey. Silas grew drowsy, his words slurring, his head eventually slumping onto the table. The act itself was a clumsy, brutal affair. They dragged his unconscious body out to the barn. Althea was the one who wielded the axe, her movements stiff and unnatural, but driven by a terrifying resolve. Clementine was frozen, a silent, horrified spectator to the butchery. The ritual that followed was the most elaborate yet. The offering was far greater, and the incantation from the grimoire was longer, the words feeling like poison in Althea's mouth. They disposed of what remained in the deepest part of the swamp, where the gators and the mud would swallow all evidence. They returned to the house, covered in filth and shame, and scrubbed their hands raw, but they could not wash away the feeling of what they had done. They waited. For a week, an agonizing silence hung over the farm. Clementine was convinced their souls were now forfeit for nothing. Then it began. It started with a small, leather pouch filled with silver dollars appearing on the porch swing. The next day, Althea found a diamond stickpin on her pillow. Day after day, a new treasure materialized. The pact had been honored, the fortune was flowing, and with it came a horrifying realization. It worked. The forbidden formula of flesh for fortune was undeniably, terrifyingly real. The success of their first human sacrifice solidified the sisters' horrifying new reality. For Althea, it was a vindication, a confirmation that she held the power to bend the world to her will. The guilt she felt was a small, manageable thing, easily suppressed by the weight of the silver coins and the gleam of the jewels that now filled a chest in her bedroom. For Clementine, however, it was the beginning of a psychological unraveling. She was haunted. She saw Silas's trusting face in her dreams. She heard his voice in the whisper of the wind through the cypress trees. She began to waste away, her already fragile spirit buckling under the weight of their crime. The house itself seemed to change. The new wealth did not bring light or warmth. It only cast deeper shadows. The opulent furniture they acquired seemed to mock the decay of the house and the decay of their souls. The silence within the walls grew heavier, thick with unspoken secrets. They stopped speaking of what they had done, but it was a constant, suffocating presence between them. Althea became the sole steward of the grimoire. She would spend hours locked in her room, poring over its macabre pages, her ambition stoked by its dark promises. She learned of other rituals, other pacts, other ways to leverage their forbidden connection to the unseen world. Clementine, meanwhile, retreated into herself. She would wander the property aimlessly, talking to herself in low whispers, her eyes darting nervously toward the swamp. She developed a series of strange, compulsive behaviors, constantly washing her hands, arranging and rearranging small objects, drawing the same spiral symbol from the ritual in the dirt over and over again. She was being consumed by the horror, while Althea was being empowered by it. The dynamic between them shifted. It was no longer a partnership of survivors. It had become the relationship of a keeper and her prisoner, a high priestess of a dark faith and her first, tormented acolyte. The house was their temple and the fortune was their god. But their god was insatiable, and it would soon demand another offering. The second victim was a traveling salesman named Elias Thorne, a man who sold patent medicines and cheap novelties from the back of his wagon. He was a talker, full of stories and easy charm, and he made the fatal error of believing the two isolated women on the remote Mississippi farm were lonely and harmless. He arrived in late summer, his wagon wheels creaking down the dusty lane. Althea greeted him with practiced warmth, inquiring about his wares, while Clementine watched from the porch, a wraith-like figure clutching a shawl around her thin shoulders. Althea invited him to stay for dinner, promising a hot meal in exchange for news of the outside world. Thorne, tired from the road, readily accepted. The pattern was the same: the drugged food, the sudden drowsiness, the feigned concern from Althea. But this time something was different. Clementine did not participate. She locked herself in her room, pressing her hands over her ears to block out the sounds she knew were coming. The sound of a body being dragged across the floorboards, the sickening thud from the barn. She could not be a party to it again. Her refusal created a new, dangerous friction between the sisters. Althea, forced to carry out the grim task alone, was filled with a cold rage. She saw Clementine's sensitivity not as a sign of a lingering conscience, but as a weakness, a liability that threatened their entire enterprise. The murder of Elias Thorne was quicker, more efficient. Althea had learned from the first time. There was less hesitation, more brutal purpose. After the ritual was complete and the remains disposed of, she confronted Clementine. The argument that followed was bitter and cruel. Althea accused her sister of being a coward, of wanting the rewards without being willing to pay the price. Clementine, in a rare moment of defiance, called Althea a monster, a butcher. The schism between them was now a chasm. They were no longer united in their sin, but divided by it. And in the days that followed, the fortune that arrived was grander than ever before, almost as if to reward Althea for her solitary resolve. Banknotes of high denomination appeared, tucked inside the pages of the grimoire. A pearl necklace materialized in a jewelry box. The pact was strengthening its hold on Althea, even as it was destroying Clementine. By the autumn of 1915, the Barlow homestead was a place of local legend and palpable dread. The disappearance of Elias Thorne did not go unnoticed in the same way the drifters had. Thorne had a route, a schedule. When he failed to arrive in the next town, questions were asked. Sheriff Bo Brody of Clay County, a pragmatic and weary man, was tasked with investigating. His initial inquiries led him down the old dirt road, the last known path of the missing salesman. He paid a visit to the Barlow sisters. He found Althea in the yard, tending to a small but unnaturally vibrant rose garden. She was calm and composed, answering his questions with an easy confidence. She admitted to seeing the salesman. He had stopped for water, she said, and then continued on his way. She expressed polite concern but claimed to know nothing more. Clementine was nowhere to be seen. Althea explained that her sister was unwell, that her nerves were delicate. Sheriff Brody felt a prickle of unease. There was something unnatural about Althea's composure, about the way her eyes, cold and dark, never seemed to blink. And there was the house itself. He noted the new dress Althea wore, the glint of a gold locket at her throat. He had known of the Barlows' poverty his whole life. This sudden, modest affluence was jarring. He asked if they had come into some money. Althea smiled and spoke of a small inheritance from a distant relative, a story that was plausible enough on the surface. But Brody wasn't convinced. As he left, he saw a fleeting shape in an upstairs window, a pale, terrified face that vanished as soon as he looked up. It was the face of a prisoner. The sheriff left the Barlow farm that day with more questions than answers, and with a growing certainty that the darkness the townspeople whispered about was not just superstitious folklore. A real and tangible evil had taken root in that isolated house, and the face in the window was its silent victim. Sheriff Brody's visit was a catalyst. For Althea, it was a warning that they needed to be more careful, that the outside world could not be ignored forever. Her paranoia, already simmering, began to boil. She saw suspicion in the eyes of the shopkeeper, heard accusation in the greetings of her neighbors. She doubled down on her secrecy, rarely leaving the farm and discouraging Clementine from doing the same. For Clementine, the sheriff's presence was a spark of hope, a sign that their horrifying secret might be brought to light. But that hope was quickly extinguished by fear. Althea became more controlling, more menacing. She locked the grimoire away, but its influence was now deeply ingrained in her. She began speaking to herself, reciting the ancient words from memory. She would conduct small, private rituals, sacrificing birds and squirrels, not for fortune, but seemingly for the sake of the act itself. The power she derived from the pact was no longer just a means to an end. It was an addiction. Clementine became her captive. Althea would lock her in her room for days at a time, convinced she would try to escape and confess their sins. The psychological torment was relentless. Althea would describe in graphic detail what she had done to their victims, forcing Clementine to listen, to share in the guilt even if she had not participated in the act. The house became a pressure cooker of madness and fear. The fortune continued to arrive, but it had lost all meaning. The beautiful objects that materialized, silk shawls, porcelain dolls, silver mirrors, felt like funeral gifts. They were monuments to the damnation of their souls. The sisters, once bound by love and survival, were now locked in a macabre dance of tormentor and tormented, their home a private asylum where the line between sanity and monstrousness had been completely erased. The curse of the gilded flesh was not just about murder. It was about the complete and utter destruction of the human spirit. As winter approached, a third man vanished. He was not a traveler or a drifter. He was a local man named Samuel Croft, a widower who lived a few miles downriver. He was known to be quiet and reclusive, but his absence was noted when he failed to show up for his weekly supply run into town. Sheriff Brody immediately suspected the Barlow sisters. There was no evidence, not a single shred of proof, but his gut told him the disappearance was connected to that cursed farm. Croft's land bordered the swamp that backed onto the Barlow property. It was too close for coincidence. This time, Brody didn't go alone. He took his young deputy, Miller, with him. The October air was crisp and cool as they rode up the lane to the now infamous house. Althea met them on the porch, her expression one of mild annoyance rather than fear. She was harder now, her features sharpened by her dark deeds. When Brody questioned her about Samuel Croft, she scoffed, claiming she hadn't seen the man in years. Her denial was flat and absolute. While Brody pressed Althea with questions, he sent Deputy Miller to circle around the back of the house to see if anything was out of the ordinary. It was a decision that would lead to the case's most disturbing discovery yet. Behind the barn, partially hidden beneath a pile of rotting burlap sacks, Miller found a patch of freshly turned earth. It was a small detail, one that could easily be overlooked. But the disturbed soil, combined with the faint foul odor that seemed to hang in the air near the barn, set his nerves on edge. He began to dig with his hands, scraping away the loose dirt. A few inches down, his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. He cleared away more soil and the object's shape became clear. It was a human jawbone, clean-picked but unmistakably human, with a distinctive gold tooth in one of the molars. Samuel Croft had been known throughout the county for his one gold tooth. The discovery of the jawbone changed the investigation from one of suspicion to one of horrifying certainty. Sheriff Brody confronted Althea, presenting her with the undeniable proof of Samuel Croft's fate. For the first time, her icy composure cracked. A flicker of panic, of animal fear, flashed in her eyes before being replaced by a defiant glare. She denied everything, claiming the bone must have washed up from the swamp, or that it was an old grave marker. Her lies were desperate and unconvincing. The sheriff placed her under arrest. As he did, a piercing shriek echoed from the second floor of the house. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Deputy Miller, his gun drawn, kicked open the front door and stormed up the creaking staircase, Brody following close behind with Althea in tow. They found the source of the scream in the last room at the end of the hall. The door was locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt. Brody slid it back and pushed the door open. The room inside was small and bare, with a single barred window. Huddled in the corner, emaciated and terrified, was Clementine. She looked like a caged animal, her hair matted, her dress torn, her eyes wide with a madness born of torment and isolation. She flinched from the light and the sight of the men, scrambling backward until she was pressed against the wall. She was muttering the same phrase over and over, a broken, whispered mantra. The flesh is the price is the flesh. Her gaze then fell upon Althea, and her expression transformed from terror to a look of profound, soul-deep hatred. It was Clementine who finally broke the silence, her voice a raw, croaking thing. She fed him to the swamp, she rasped, pointing a trembling finger at her sister. She fed them all to the swamp, for the fortune. The confession tumbled out of her, a torrent of horrifying details, a verbal map of their descent into hell. Clementine's confession, delivered in the cramped, squalid room of her imprisonment, was a rambling and disjointed narrative of the macabre. She spoke of the grimoire of the pact and of the rituals in the cypress swamp. She detailed the murders of the drifter, the salesman, and Samuel Croft, her words painting a grotesque picture of Althea's cold-blooded efficiency. She described the arrival of the fortune, the coins, the jewels, the bank notes, and how each new treasure felt like another nail in her coffin. She confessed her own complicity in the first murder, a guilt that had clearly eaten away at her sanity. As she spoke, Althea stood motionless in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. She did not deny the accusations. She did not try to defend herself. She simply stared at her sister with an expression of utter contempt, as if Clementine's betrayal was a far greater crime than the murders themselves. Sheriff Brody and Deputy Miller listened in stunned silence, the scope of the horror far exceeding anything they could have imagined. This wasn't a simple case of robbery and murder. This was something else, something ancient and twisted. It was a tale of black magic and human sacrifice, a story that belonged in the pages of a forbidden book, not in the official records of Clay County. Based on Clementine's broken directions, they knew they had to search the swamp clearing she described. Althea was locked in the town jail, silent and uncooperative. Clementine was taken into protective custody, placed under the care of the town doctor, her mind clearly shattered by her ordeal. That evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Sheriff Brody organized a small search party. Armed with lanterns and shovels, they headed into the dark, tangled expanse of the bayou behind the Barlow house, toward the place Clementine called the altar of the earth. They were searching for the bodies of the victims, but they were about to find something infinitely more disturbing. The swamp held more than just the secrets of the dead. It held the physical evidence of the sisters' unholy pact. The clearing was exactly where Clementine had said it would be. The air was unnaturally cold and still, and the ground underfoot felt spongy and wrong. The lantern light cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the surrounding cypress trees, which seemed to lean in, as if listening. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat-topped rock, stained with dark, flacking patches that could only be dried blood. The ground around it was bare in a perfect circle, despite the lush growth of the rest of the swamp. It was here that they found the first sigil, the spiral pattern Clementine had described, etched into the packed earth. As the men began to dig around the rock, their shovels met with resistance almost immediately. It was not the remains of the victims they found. It was something far stranger. They unearthed dozens upon dozens of small, cloth bundles, tied with twine and buried in a shallow layer of dirt. Each bundle, when opened, contained a bizarre collection of items: animal bones, human teeth, scraps of clothing, and strange, hand-carved wooden fetishes. But there was something else, something common to every single bundle: a piece of flesh. A finger, an ear, a lock of hair still attached to a piece of scalp. They were sacrificial tokens, preserved in salt and herbs, offerings left for whatever dark entity the sisters had been communing with. The sheer quantity of them was staggering. It spoke of a prolonged period of ritualistic activity, of countless smaller sacrifices made before they had escalated to murder. It was a horrifying testament to the depth of their obsession and the methodical nature of their madness. As the men continued to dig, a young deputy let out a strangled cry. His shovel had unearthed something larger. It was a human skull, its empty sockets seeming to stare up at them from the dark, wet earth. They had found the victims. But the true horror was not what they found, but what they couldn't find. The bodies were not whole. They had been systematically dismembered, pieces of them missing, pieces that matched the grisly contents of the ritual bundles. The gruesome excavation in the swamp continued for 2 days. They recovered the partial remains of 3 men, identified as Elias Thorne and Samuel Croft. The bodies had been butchered, pieces of them used in the sisters' horrifying rituals, the rest thrown into the deeper parts of the bayou for the wildlife to consume. The entire county was gripped by a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. The story of the Barlow sisters, the cannibal witches of Clay County, as the newspapers would soon call them, spread like wildfire. The tale was a perfect storm of poverty, black magic, and murder, a Southern Gothic nightmare made real. It confirmed the darkest superstitions of the local population and became a cautionary tale told to frighten children for generations to come. The investigation, however, was far from over. Sheriff Brody's focus now turned to the house itself. Armed with Clementine's confession and the evidence from the swamp, he and his deputies conducted a thorough search of the Barlow homestead, looking for the grimoire, the source of this evil, and for the fortune it had supposedly produced. They tore the house apart, ripping up floorboards, checking behind walls, and sifting through the ashes in the fireplace. They found the jewelry, the coins, and the banknotes hidden in various places, a testament to the truth of Clementine's story. The wealth was real and it was stained with blood. Yet the book, the dark heart of the entire affair, remained elusive. Althea, sitting silently in her jail cell, refused to speak of it. Clementine, lost in her own fractured psyche, could not remember where Althea had hidden it. It was as if the grimoire had vanished, recalled by the infernal powers that had created it. Without the book, a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. It was the why behind the what, the instruction manual for their descent into monstrosity. And as they searched, a chilling thought occurred to Sheriff Brody. What if the book was never meant to be found? What if its purpose was simply to sow chaos and then disappear, leaving only destruction in its wake? The legal proceedings against Althea Barlow were swift. The evidence was overwhelming: the remains in the swamp, the stolen items from the victims, and most damningly, the detailed confession of her own sister. Clementine was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. Her testimony, however, was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. She took the stand, a frail and broken figure, and recounted the entire horrifying saga for the court. She spoke of their desperation, of Althea finding the book, and of the escalating cycle of sacrifice and reward. The courtroom was silent, captivated by the macabre tale. Throughout the trial, Althea remained a figure of chilling defiance. She showed no remorse, no fear, no emotion at all. She watched the proceedings with a detached, almost bored expression, her cold eyes occasionally fixing on her sister with a look of pure venom. She refused to testify in her own defense, offering no explanation or denial. Her silence was more unnerving than any confession could have been. It was the silence of someone who believed she was above the laws of man, someone who had communed with powers far older and more terrible. It took the jury less than an hour to find her guilty on 3 counts of murder. The judge, calling her acts an affront to God and humanity, sentenced her to death by hanging. The date was set for the 1st of December. As she was led from the courtroom, a reporter shouted a question, asking if she had anything to say. For the first and only time, Althea spoke. She stopped, turned her head slowly, and looked directly at the crowd. A small, cruel smile touched her lips. "You cannot kill what you do not understand," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The price was paid. The fortune is mine." Then she was gone, leaving a wave of unease and confusion in her wake. What did she mean? Was it just the defiant rambling of a condemned killer, or was it a final, chilling invocation of the dark power she had served? The weeks leading up to Althea's execution were tense. She remained in her cell, a model prisoner, quiet and compliant. She made no appeals, spoke to no one, and ate the food given to her without complaint. Her unnerving calm was a source of constant discussion among the townsfolk and her jailers. It was as if she knew something they didn't, as if her sentence was a mere inconvenience in a much larger, darker game. Meanwhile, the Barlow homestead was officially seized by the county. Before it was to be auctioned off, Sheriff Brody and Deputy Miller were tasked with a final inventory and cleanup of the property. It was a grim task. The house felt colder and more oppressive than ever, as if the evil that had transpired there had permanently stained the very air. They boxed up the sisters' meager personal belongings and cataloged the fortune, the collection of coins, jewelry, and other valuables. It was during this final sweep that Deputy Miller made a discovery that brought the entire case back into sharp, horrifying focus. In Althea's bedroom, tucked away inside a small, unassuming music box, he found a hidden journal. It was not the grimoire, but Althea's personal diary. The entries began in the spring of 1915, just before she found the Book of Rituals. Her early writings were filled with despair and anger at their poverty. Then, the tone shifted dramatically. She wrote of finding the Book of Roots and of her excitement at its promises. Her entries became a chilling chronicle of her transformation. She described the first ritual with the chicken, her initial doubts, and then her elation at finding the gold coin. But as the journal progressed, the entries became more disturbing, revealing a mind that was not just desperate but deeply narcissistic and cruel long before the influence of the grimoire. Althea's journal revealed a far more disturbing truth than anyone had anticipated. The grimoire had not corrupted a desperate woman. It had merely given a monstrous one the tools and the justification to act on her darkest impulses. She wrote about her sister, Clementine, with a chilling mix of affection and contempt. She saw Clementine's gentleness as a weakness to be exploited, her empathy as a flaw to be corrected. "Clementine weeps for the chicken," one entry read. "She does not understand that sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. The world takes from the weak. I will teach her to be strong. I will teach her to take." The journal entries detailing the murders were cold and methodical. She referred to the victims not as people, but as offerings or tithes. There was no remorse, only a logistical assessment of the risks and rewards. She wrote about the murder of Silas, the drifter. "The first tithe was messy. Clementine was useless, paralyzed by her pity. I see now that I must be the one to bear the strength for us both. The return was swift. The pact is true." Most disturbingly, the later entries revealed that Althea had begun to enjoy the power she held over others. The fortune was becoming secondary to the thrill of the ritual, to the act of dominance and destruction. She wrote about tricking Elias Thorne, the salesman, with a sense of pride in her own cunning. "He believed my smile," she wrote. "Men are so easily fooled by the performance of womanly frailty. It is their fatal conceit." The journal was the missing piece. It was the Rosetta Stone for Althea's soul, and it was black to the core. Sheriff Brody realized that they had not been dealing with two sisters who were victims of a dark influence. They had been dealing with a master manipulator and her long-suffering victim, a predator who had found the perfect weapon in a book of forbidden lore. The evil wasn't in the swamp, or in the house, or even in the grimoire. The evil was inside Althea Barlow all along. The day of Althea Barlow's execution arrived. It was a cold, gray morning on the 1st of December. A crowd had gathered in the courthouse square to witness the final act of the horrifying saga. Althea was led to the gallows, her steps steady, her head held high. She showed no fear. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not with panic, but with a look of detached curiosity. When asked for her last words, she simply smiled and said, "My debt is paid." The words were cryptic, chilling, and left the crowd in a stunned silence. The execution was carried out, and the life of Althea Barlow was extinguished. But her death did not bring the closure the town of Clay's Landing so desperately craved. In fact, it was the beginning of a new and even stranger chapter in the macabre history of the Barlow sisters. Following the execution, Clementine was transferred to the state asylum. Her condition had not improved. She remained lost in her own world of guilt and terror, often found tracing the spiral sigil on the walls of her room. The Barlow homestead and all its contents, including the blood-stained fortune, were scheduled to be sold at a public auction. The town wanted to erase the memory, to profit from the tragedy and move on. But the curse of the Barlow sisters was not so easily dispelled. The story you have heard so far is the official record, the tale pieced together from confessions and evidence. But there are parts of this history that were never recorded, secrets that only a few knew. If you wish to journey deeper into this forbidden archive and ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the dark corners of the past, hit the subscribe button and join us. Because the story of the Barlow fortune was far from over, and its final chapter is perhaps the most disturbing of all. The auction of the Barlow estate was a morbid affair. People came from all over the state, drawn by the lurid tales of the Witch sisters. They came to bid on the furniture, the farm equipment, and the house itself, but what they really wanted was a piece of the notoriety, a souvenir from a real-life horror story. The most anticipated part of the auction was the sale of the fortune, the collection of jewelry, coins, and banknotes that had been purchased with human blood. Mr. Abernathy, the general store owner, bought a set of silver spoons. The Prout family, whose goat had been one of the first sacrifices, bought a pearl necklace, perhaps as a form of poetic justice. Each item was sold, the proceeds meant to go to the county. The buyers took their morbid treasures home, but the story didn't end there. A dark cloud seemed to follow the items from the Barlow house. Mr. Abernathy dropped dead of a heart attack a week after the auction, clutching one of the silver spoons in his hand. The Prout's eldest son fell from a hayloft and broke his neck, the pearl necklace found tangled in the hay beside him. A banker who bought a stash of the antique gold coins lost his entire family to a sudden, virulent fever. One by one, those who had purchased a piece of the Barlow fortune met with tragedy, misfortune, and untimely death. A new wave of fear swept through Clay County. The townsfolk began to believe the fortune was cursed, that Althea's final words were not a defiant boast but a statement of fact. Her debt was paid, but the dark entity she had dealt with was still collecting interest, and it was doing so from anyone who dared to touch its gilded, blood-soaked property. People started to get rid of the items, some throwing them into the river, others burying them in their yards, trying to sever their connection to the evil that clung to them like a shroud. The Barlow house itself, bought by a speculator from out of town, proved impossible to sell. No family would live in it. It quickly fell into disrepair, becoming the town's haunted landmark. Teenagers would dare each other to spend a night within its decaying walls, and those who were brave or foolish enough to try would come back with stories of strange noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched by an unseen, malevolent presence. Some claimed to have seen the pale, ghostly figure of Clementine staring from the window of her upstairs prison. The house became a monument to the sisters' evil, a place where the tragedy of their story was etched into the very timber. But the most significant part of the lingering curse involved the grimoire. While Sheriff Brody had never found the book, someone else apparently had. Years later, in the 1930s, a young man who had been a boy during the time of the Barlow murders confessed on his deathbed. He and his friends had snuck onto the Barlow property just after the sisters were arrested, before the police had sealed it off. Driven by morbid curiosity, they had searched the house. In the cold, dead fireplace, hidden behind a loose brick in the chimney, they found it, the ancient, leather-bound book. The boys, terrified by its disturbing contents, didn't know what to do. They were too scared to take it to the authorities, fearing they would be implicated in the crimes. So they made a pact. They took the book deep into the swamp, to the same clearing where the sisters had performed their rituals, and they burned it. They watched as the vellum pages curled and blackened, the strange script and horrifying images consumed by the flames. They swore never to speak of it again. They believed they had destroyed the evil, but they were wrong. Some things cannot be destroyed so easily. The ideas, the dark knowledge contained within that book, had been released into the world, and the fire had not cleansed it, it had merely set it free. What of Clementine, the last of the Barlows? She spent the remainder of her life in the Mississippi State Asylum at Whitfield. She never recovered her sanity. She existed in a state of perpetual terror, haunted by the ghosts of her past. She would have long conversations with people who weren't there, and she would scream in the night, tormented by nightmares from which she could never wake. Nurses at the asylum reported strange occurrences in her presence. Objects would move on their own. Whispers would be heard from her empty room. A palpable cold would descend whenever she was near. It was as if the supernatural forces her sister had courted had latched onto her, the surviving member of the bloodline, and would not let her go. She was particularly obsessed with drawing. She was given paper and charcoal to keep her calm, and she would spend hours, days, weeks, creating the same image over and over again. It was a detailed, intricate drawing of the symbols and diagrams from the grimoire, reproduced from memory with terrifying accuracy. She filled hundreds of pages with them, creating a new, fragmented copy of the forbidden book. Her doctors saw it as a symptom of her madness, a manifestation of her trauma. They had no idea they were looking at pages from a book that had driven her and her sister to commit unspeakable acts. They collected her drawings, labeling them as products of a disturbed mind and filing them away. They were preserving the very evil they were trying to treat, creating an archive of the curse. Clementine Barlow died in the asylum in 1968, an old woman who had outlived everyone else involved in the case. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the asylum grounds, her story seemingly ending there. But the drawings, her macabre legacy, remained, filed away in the asylum's archives, a dormant poison waiting for a curious hand to open the file and read the forbidden script once more. The story could end there, a chilling but self-contained piece of macabre local history, a tale of two sisters, a cursed book, and a town left scarred by their crimes. But the tendrils of this story reach further than the borders of Clay County. In the late 1970s, a young psychology student researching the history of the Whitfield Asylum came across Clementine Barlow's case file. Intrigued by the notes about her obsessive drawings, he requested to see them. He was given a box filled with hundreds of pages of Clementine's charcoal sketches. The student, whose name has been deliberately omitted from the records, was not just a psychologist. He had a deep and abiding interest in the occult. As he studied the strange, intricate symbols and diagrams, he recognized them for what they were. They were not the random scribbles of a madwoman. They were pieces of a coherent, albeit terrifying, system of ritual magic. He saw patterns, recognized sigils from other lesser-known occult texts. He realized he was looking at the reconstructed remnants of a powerful grimoire. He became obsessed. He spent months studying the drawings, cross-referencing them, trying to piece together the rituals they described. He secretly photographed every single page, creating his own copy of the Barlow grimoire. According to his later journals, which were found after his own mysterious disappearance, he believed he could harness the power of the rituals without paying the bloody price the Barlow sisters had. He thought he was smarter, that he could control the darkness. He was a fool. He attempted one of the rituals, a lesser one described in the drawings that supposedly granted clarity of vision and knowledge of the unseen. He wasn't trading flesh for fortune. He was trading a piece of his own sanity for a glimpse behind the curtain, and whatever he saw on the other side shattered him completely. The student's experiment was a catastrophic failure. His journals described the aftermath of the ritual. He wrote of seeing things, of being followed by shadows, of hearing whispers that knew his name. He described a thinning of the veil between his world and another, a colder, hungrier world. He had not gained control. He had simply opened a door and invited something terrible to step through. He tried to reverse the ritual, but it was too late. The knowledge he had sought came at the cost of his peace and his sanity. His final journal entries are a frantic, paranoid scrawl, filled with sketches of the same symbols Clementine had drawn, but now they were twisted, distorted, as if seen through a lens of pure terror. He wrote of a tall man in the corner of his room, a being with no face that simply watched him. He wrote of the gilded hunger and the price of sight. His last coherent entry simply read, "It wasn't the book that was the curse. It was the knowledge. Once you know you are part of the pact, you always owe a debt." Shortly after that final entry, he vanished. His apartment was found in disarray, the walls covered in frantic charcoal drawings. The photographs he had taken of Clementine's sketches were gone. He was never seen again. The disappearance reignited interest in the old Barlow case, but only among a small circle of occult researchers and paranormal investigators. The official story remained sealed. The Barlow sisters were killers and their case was closed. But for those who knew where to look, the story was a living, breathing thing, a curse that had jumped from a book to two sisters to a set of drawings, and finally to a foolish young man who thought he could master it. The curse was not tied to an object but to the information itself. It was a forbidden history that was infectious, a macabre story that, once learned, could never be unlearned. Today, the physical legacy of the Barlow sisters has almost entirely vanished. The town of Clay's Landing is gone, swallowed up by a larger municipality in the 1980s. The old courthouse where Althea was sentenced was torn down. The asylum at Whitfield still stands, but the old archives are sealed, and Clementine Barlow's file, along with her disturbing drawings, has mysteriously gone missing. The Barlow homestead itself finally succumbed to the elements, collapsing in on itself during a hurricane in the 1970s. The swamp has reclaimed the land, and the clearing with its blood-stained altar is now lost beneath decades of overgrowth. On the surface, it seems the earth itself has tried to erase the stain of what happened there. But the story persists. It has become a potent piece of Mississippi folklore, a ghost story told around campfires. The details have shifted over the years. The sisters' names sometimes change, the number of victims fluctuates, but the dark heart of the tale remains the same. Two women who traded flesh for fortune and the terrible price they and others had to pay. Folklorists who have studied the legend note its unusual tenacity. Unlike other local ghost stories, the tale of the Barlow sisters does not fade. In fact, it seems to gain strength with each retelling. Some have proposed a chilling theory, that the story itself functions as a kind of substitute for the grimoire, that by hearing the tale, by learning the basic formula of the sisters' pact, a sliver of that forbidden knowledge is passed on. The story primes the listener, planting a dark seed of possibility. And for a certain kind of person, a person who is desperate enough, or ambitious enough, or foolish enough, that seed might just be enough to make them start digging for the roots of the story, seeking the same power the sisters once wielded. This leads us to the most disturbing and unprovable aspect of the entire case, the concept of the curse's continuity. Is it possible that the entity or force the Barlow sisters made a pact with is still active? The grimoire may be destroyed, the sisters long dead, but the pact itself, the fundamental equation of sacrifice for reward, is a piece of knowledge, and knowledge, once unleashed, is impossible to contain. Occult traditions from around the world are filled with the concept of tulpas or egregores, thought forms, entities created and sustained by collective human belief and emotion. The more people who believe in the entity, the more who tell its story, the more powerful it becomes. Could the legend of the Barlow sisters be fueling the very thing they communed with? Is it possible that every time the story is told, every time a shudder runs down a listener's spine, a small amount of energy is fed to the entity that still waits in the spaces between worlds, the entity that answers to the pact of the gilded flesh? It's a terrifying thought. It reframes the story not as a historical account of a cold case, but as a potentially active and ongoing supernatural event. It would mean that Althea's final, cryptic words, "You cannot kill what you do not understand," were not just a boast but a literal truth. They had tapped into something ancient and parasitic, and their story became the vector through which the parasite could continue to find new hosts. This theory would explain the chain of tragedy, the cursed fortune, the asylum hauntings, the student's disappearance. They weren't just aftershocks of the original crime. They were evidence of the curse's continued existence, a curse that latches onto anyone who gets too close to the forbidden knowledge. A curse that you, the viewer, are now closer to than you were an hour ago. Let's re-examine the central mystery from a purely rational perspective, stripping away the supernatural elements. Is there a logical explanation for what happened in Clay County in 1915? A skeptic might argue that the grimoire was not a book of magic, but a catalyst for psychosis. Althea and Clementine were two isolated, uneducated, and starving women on the brink of madness. Perhaps Althea found an old book, maybe a strange herbal or medical text, and her desperate mind twisted its contents into a blueprint for a magical pact. She created a folie à deux, a shared delusion, with her more suggestible younger sister. The murders were not sacrifices, but simple, brutal acts of robbery-homicide committed against vulnerable targets. They preyed on travelers, took their valuables, and disposed of their bodies. The fortune was not materialized from the ether. It was the stolen goods of their victims. The antique coins and jewelry could have belonged to Elias Thorne or Silas the Drifter, men whose histories were unknown. This is a clean, logical explanation. It accounts for the crimes and the sudden wealth. It paints Althea not as a witch, but as a cunning and ruthless sociopath who manipulated her mentally ill sister into becoming her accomplice. But this rational explanation, as neat as it is, leaves several unsettling questions unanswered. Where did that first gold coin come from, the one that appeared in the well after the sacrifice of a single chicken? How did banknotes and other valuables continue to appear long after the victims were dead and their possessions seemingly accounted for? And what about the chain of misfortune that followed the auctioned items? Coincidence can explain one or two tragedies, but the sheer number of them strains credulity. The rational explanation feels incomplete. It tidies up the horror, but it fails to capture the profound wrongness of the events, the palpable sense of a hostile, unseen force that was felt by so many people involved in the case. The ambiguity lies in that gap between the known facts and the inexplicable details. The case of the Barlow sisters exists in a gray area where history and folklore intertwine, where forensic evidence ends and the chilling whispers of the supernatural begin. Let us consider the house itself. Long after it collapsed, when the land was being cleared for development in the 1990s, the construction crew made a final, unsettling discovery. While excavating the foundation, they found a small, hidden cellar beneath the main house, a room not present on any known floor plan. The entrance had been bricked up from the inside. When they broke through the wall, they found the room was not empty. Inside was a single, small wooden chair facing the corner, and etched into the stone walls, over and over and over again, was the same spiral sigil that had been found in the swamp clearing and in Clementine's drawings. But there was something else. Scratched into the floor beneath the chair was a sentence, crudely carved into the stone. It demands a witness. What does this mean? Was this a prison cell, a place of ritual and meditation? Or was it a room where one sister would force the other to sit and bear witness to the horrors being committed above? The phrase, "it demands a witness," is profoundly disturbing. It implies that the act of observation was a necessary component of the pact. It wasn't enough to simply commit the act. The act had to be seen, its horror acknowledged, to complete the circuit of energy. This adds a new layer of psychological terror to Clementine's ordeal. She wasn't just an accomplice or a prisoner. She may have been a required instrument in the ritual, her terror a key ingredient in the horrifying alchemy. The discovery of this room deepens the mystery, tilting the scales away from simple psychosis and back toward a deliberate, methodical, and truly horrifying form of ritualistic evil. Perhaps the true nature of the Barlow sisters' crime was not simply trading flesh for fortune, but something more profound. Perhaps they were trading their humanity for survival. The grimoire offered them a way out of their desperate situation, but the price was an erosion of the very things that made them human: empathy, compassion, and morality. With each sacrifice, they gave up a piece of their soul. In return, they received material wealth, a hollow substitute for the humanity they had lost. Althea made this trade willingly, perhaps even eagerly. Her journal suggests she had very little of that humanity to begin with. The pact simply allowed her to shed the final, inconvenient remnants of it. Clementine, however, fought the transaction. Her descent into madness was a symptom of this internal war. Her spirit was trying to reject the poison of the pact, but it was too late. She was a witness, a participant, and the curse had taken root in her as surely as it had in her sister. This interpretation reframes the story as a tragic, Faustian bargain. The sisters were not just murderers, they were subjects in a horrifying metaphysical experiment. They tested the limits of human depravity and found that there were none, so long as the reward was great enough. The fortune they received was a physical manifestation of their spiritual emptiness. The more they gained in worldly goods, the more they lost of themselves. This is, perhaps, the ultimate lesson from this forbidden history, that true poverty is not a lack of money, but a lack of soul. The Barlow sisters escaped one form of starvation only to succumb to a far more profound and eternal kind of hunger, a gilded hunger that could never be satisfied. The final piece of this dark puzzle lies in the title of the pact itself, the Pact of the Gilded Flesh. The word gilded is crucial. It means to be covered thinly with gold leaf or gold paint. It implies a surface-level beauty that conceals a core of lesser value. The fortune the sisters received was gilded. It was beautiful, valuable, and desirable on the surface, but it was fundamentally corrupt, a cheap imitation of true prosperity. It was a lie. The pact did not create wealth. It merely transferred it, leaving a trail of death and misery in its wake. And the flesh, too, was gilded. The sisters presented their offerings to the entity as a tribute, a thing of value. But the lives they took were devalued, treated as mere commodities. They gilded the flesh of their victims with the veneer of ritual significance to hide the ugly, brutal truth of murder. The entire enterprise was an illusion, a cheap, golden trick played on two desperate women. The entity they dealt with was not a god, but a predator. It offered them a golden apple, knowing it was filled with worms. The story of Althea and Clementine Barlow is a cautionary tale, but its warning is not about ghosts or demons. It is about the seductive nature of easy solutions, the corrupting power of desperation, and the terrifying thinness of the veil that separates civilization from savagery. They did not discover a secret to wealth. They discovered a secret to their own monstrousness, a secret that lies dormant within us all, waiting for the right circumstances, the right catalyst, the right forbidden book to awaken it. It is a deeply unsettling thought that the path to the Barlow homestead is a journey any one of us could take, given the right amount of hunger and the wrong kind of hope. So where does this leave us? We are left with a story that resists easy explanation, a story with a body count that extends far beyond the 3 known victims, a cold case that still radiates a palpable chill over a century later. We are left with the ghost of Althea, defiant to the end, and the ghost of Clementine, forever trapped in her torment. We are left with the cursed fortune, the vanished grimoire, and the echoes of a pact made in the dark heart of a Mississippi swamp. The rational mind seeks to dismiss it as a tragic case of murder and madness, while the whispers of the past insist that something more ancient and more terrible was at play. Perhaps the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the murky depths between the two. The evil of the Barlow sisters was undeniably human, born of cruelty, desperation, and greed. But perhaps in their darkest hour they reached out into the void, and something truly inhuman reached back. They may have opened a door that was never fully closed, leaving a tear in the fabric of the world, a place where the rules of reality are thin and the gilded hunger of the void can still be felt. This is the enduring power of such forbidden histories. They remind us that the world we inhabit is built upon a foundation of older, darker stories. They remind us that not all questions have answers, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some cases are destined to remain cold, not because the evidence is lost, but because the truth is something our modern, enlightened minds are simply not equipped to comprehend. And the creepy case of the sisters who traded flesh for fortune is, and will likely always remain, one of them. The final, lingering question is what happened to the knowledge. The student who photographed Clementine's drawings vanished in the 1970s. What did he do with those photographs? Were they destroyed? Are they sitting in a box in some forgotten storage unit? Or did he pass them on, either deliberately or accidentally? In today's world of digital information and endless archives, the idea of a lost text is becoming obsolete. Knowledge, once recorded, can be copied and disseminated with impossible speed. A set of photographs could be scanned, uploaded, and shared across the globe in seconds. The contents of the Barlow grimoire, filtered through the mad hands of Clementine and the obsessive research of a doomed student, could very well be out there, lurking in some obscure corner of the internet, waiting for the next desperate soul to stumble upon it. The ritual is no longer bound to a physical book. It has become a piece of data, a ghost in the machine. It's a modern, terrifying thought. The curse is no longer confined to a single, haunted farmhouse in rural Mississippi. It has the potential to be everywhere at once. The story of Althea and Clementine Barlow serves as a stark warning. It is a testament to the idea that some doors are best left unopened, some histories are best left forbidden, and some knowledge carries a price far too high to pay. For in the end, the fortune they gained was temporary, but the damnation they earned is eternal, and the entity they served is patient. It has waited over a century. It can wait again. It knows that human nature never changes. There will always be desperation. There will always be greed. And there will always be someone willing to pay the price, to trade a little flesh for a gilded, glittering, and ultimately horrifying fortune.